Here's a question. What do you get when you take a hairless sausage with legs, give it the social structure of a beehive, the pain tolerance of Wolverine, and the metabolism of a desert cactus? Well, you actually get a real animal. Heterocephalus glaber, i.e. the naked mole rat. At first glance, it might look like someone magicked Deadpool into a rat. And honestly, this is a closer comparison than you might think, seeing that this guy basically feels no pain, is immune to cancer, and is the closest thing we have to an immortal rodent. But we'll get to all of that later. Visually, the naked mole rat lives up to its name, and it's certainly not winning any beauty contests. Its body is mostly hairless, with wrinkled pink or yellowish skin. It has tiny, barely functional eyes, which are essentially only good enough to sense light and nothing else. Their ears have somehow disappeared, with instead just odd-looking small openings on the side of their heads. And then finally, they have giant protruding teeth that sit outside their mouth and can be used while their mouth is closed. Kind of like ugly, not so cool saber teeth. And so with all of this said, you might be wondering why in the HE double hockey stick would something look, well, this hideous? And the answer is its environment, because they live in the belly of Earth itself, i.e. underground. They've lost their fur because their homes are pretty warm anyways. Their eyes aren't functional because they don't need to be, living in perpetual darkness. Ear holes are better than ears because it reduces rubbing against the dirt while also providing protection against debris. And then they have giant teeth that are usable when their mouth is sealed because it allows them to literally dig holes with them without actually swallowing the dirt. And this is only some of the many adaptations this creature has undergone due to its chosen home. Because, for example, while most mammals are out here playing by the rules, in other words, breathe air, feel pain, get cancer, age, and die like a proper organism, the naked mole rat pretty much just said no to all of that. And then, did I mention that they're cold-blooded? Because, yeah, they are. And this might all sound like a joke, but it's not. So let me explain. But to do that, we'll have to dig a bit. And I mean that literally, because like I said, this is all because of where they live, underground. This weird little mammal is native to East Africa, mostly the drier, grassy, and semi-arid parts of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. But you won't find it scampering around the savannah or lounging in the sun. Instead, you'll find it about a meter or two beneath your feet, in a vast underground labyrinth. And while these colonies aren't super deep, they can be up to 3 kilometers long, which is crazy when you consider that size-wise, they're only about 7 centimeters or 3 inches in length. And then once you go in this labyrinth, you're not coming back up, at least if you're a naked mole rat, as they are fully subterranean, spending the entirety of their lives sealed inside the earth, unlike many other quote-unquote moles, which you might find in your backyard, which do come up to the surface. And by the way, even though naked mole rats have both the word mole and rat together, it is technically neither, instead belonging to its own little group within the rodent order called Phyomorpha, which means it's actually more closely related to porcupines than to either of the things it's named after. But back to its lovely home. While the tunnels are far-reaching in length, they are also very cramped, humid, and pitch black, like permanent midnight black. The air is also unsurprisingly quite thin, dropping to levels which would cause hypoxia in humans, and they're able to survive for extended times even at levels of 5% oxygen. And just to drive home how crazy this is, humans wouldn't only be able to not function well at this level, but we would literally pass out and eventually die, with most people losing consciousness at around the 10% mark. And just to make this even more impressive, a 2017 study showed that naked mole rats can survive even in 0% oxygen, and for up to 18 minutes at that. Now, if you're thinking this sounds impossible for pretty much anything, especially a mammal, you'd be right, because it kind of is. But naked mole rats have hacked their metabolism in a way that not many other creatures have pulled off. You see, here's how most mammals work. Your cells take in oxygen to help break down glucose through aerobic respiration. And this is efficient and makes a lot of ATP and keeps you alive. But the problem is, once the oxygen runs out, the whole system crashes and crashes fast, which is when cells start panicking, tissues get damaged, and brain cells die within minutes. But naked mole rats, they've got a plan B. Instead, when oxygen levels drop for them, instead of going into anaerobic glycolysis like other mammals, which is a process that relies on glucose and produces a ton of lactic acid, which is, by the way, why you experience a burn when doing certain workouts and activities, they instead switch to something really unusual. They start metabolizing fructose, like the fruit sugar. In most mammals, fructose metabolism is mostly limited to the liver and a little bit in the kidneys. But in the naked mole rats, it's much more extensive, with them having fructose transporters and enzymes in their heart and brain as well, which is essentially unheard of. And what this means is that when oxygen is gone, they can bypass the typical pathway which uses glucose, and instead run their critical organs on the fruit sugar, i.e. fructose. And now, this might sound cool and sciencey and all, but how does this really help? Well, this strategy does a couple of brilliant things. First, it avoids lactic acid buildup, which again not only causes pain, but also cellular damage. And then secondly, and more importantly, fructose metabolism doesn't rely on oxygen at all. So while most mammals are gasping for breath, naked mole rats are cruising along on what's essentially an emergency sugar stash. But they don't stop there, because they also manage to drastically reduce their heart rate, as well as suppress their metabolism, especially in non-essential tissues, which effectively means that their body prioritizes the brain and heart, while everything else powers down to save energy. So kind of like a biological low power mode. And interestingly, this fruit sugar survival strategy is actually found in certain other organisms, like yeast, where this process is partially responsible for why brewing and baking works. So thank you, fruit sugar. So yes, it is found in different organisms, but just definitely not mammals. But that's kind of the whole point. These funny little guys aren't just surviving underground, but they're thriving in a place where mammals really just aren't supposed to work. And this metabolic wizardry isn't the only thing it's changed to deal with the toxic atmosphere, because low oxygen isn't even the biggest problem down there. In those sealed burrows, it's not just a lack of breathable air that's dangerous, it's also the buildup of specifically toxic air, and to be exact, the other side of our breathing cycle, carbon dioxide. In fact, it's so bad down there that they've adapted to the point where they can survive breathing air with a carbon dioxide level that would be incredibly dangerous to humans and most other animals, causing a condition known as hypercapnia. And the reason it's so dangerous isn't just because carbon dioxide displaces oxygen, but rather because as it's inhaled, it mixes into your body fluids, forming something called carbonic acid, and thus dropping our blood's pH level, which if you didn't know, the lower the pH, the more acidic something is. So basically turning your blood into acid. And so unsurprisingly, this condition causes excruciating burning pain, inflammation, headaches, confusion, and in extreme cases, even death. But naked mole rats, they don't even flinch. Remember when I said they're basically immune to pain of certain types? Well, this is exactly the reason why. They've evolved a kind of chemical pain resistance that lets them shrug off exactly the kind of damage hypercapnia would cause in other mammals. And how do we know this, you ask? Because researchers have tried pretty much everything to inflict pain onto our poor little friends, which thankfully did not work. For example, take capsaicin, the compound that makes chili peppers burn. When you give it to or put it on naked mole rats, no reaction. And the same thing applies to literal acid injections, which would normally cause intense pain to say the least. But with Rufus, nothing. Absolutely nothing. And it's not just that they're ignoring it with some incredibly high pain tolerance, it's that they literally don't even register it. And the reason for this starts with mutations in a key molecule called substance P, and then in the NAV 1.7 sodium channel, which together are incredibly important for transmitting pain signals, especially with those related to acid-like pain. In fact, humans who are born with similar mutations suffer from a condition called congenital insensitivity to pain, which is dangerous for us, but perfect for an animal living in carbon dioxide-rich tunnels. And what's really clever about all of this is that this pain resistance is highly specific. They still feel mechanical pain like cuts or pinches, and they do respond to heat. It's just that they fine-tune their sensory system to ignore the exact types of discomfort that would be constant in their underground lifestyle. However, simply ignoring pain is not enough, because even if you don't feel it, a low oxygen, high stress environment is constantly triggering cell damage, which in turn creates another massive risk, cancer. And this is where naked mole rats go from simple, weird little creatures to actual biological freakazoids, because they basically do not get cancer. Not only is it essentially absent in both wild populations and lab colonies, even when researchers purposely try to induce tumors, it does nothing. And this was so shocking that for a long time, scientists didn't even believe the data. And it was only after study confirmed it that they finally admitted that it was true, which thus begs the question of how. And the answer essentially comes down to two things, with the first being bubble wrap, kind of. Mammals produce something called hyaluronan, which is a jelly-like substance found in the space between cells. Normally, this stuff is pretty lightweight, but the naked mole rat basically makes the double-stuffed extra thick version. And this is important because it basically stops tumors from forming by giving the body more wiggle room to detect it early and stop it before it can grow. So that's the first reason. And then the second comes down to their actual DNA repair mechanisms, which are super robust compared to normal. And so basically it's the combination of their system not only being able to resist cancer, but also being optimized to prevent it from the get-go. And this is obviously super cool and all, but it does bring up the question of why they would evolve it in the first place. Because even in high-stress environments, cancers wouldn't generally form unless there is one extra condition: time. Now, naked mole rats live in eusocial colonies, which basically means there's one queen and a few males who do all the breeding, and everyone else just kind of exists in a cramped tunnel. And they do so for quite a long time, as they are unusually long-lived for their size, being able to survive for up to 30 years or more. Which might not sound crazy, but to put that into perspective, other rodents of similar sizes like the house mice, live up to 2 years if they're lucky. And this translates to less litters per year than normal, with naked mole rats usually breeding only once per year. And so if you're a mammal that doesn't reproduce much and has the ability to live for a long time in a very stressful environment, it's suddenly super useful to not have your workers dropping dead from cancer. So in other words, it's pretty much necessary to their entire way of life. Which, speaking of, brings me to the next point, which makes these hairless sausages so freaky. So quick recap on their homes. It's a tunnel underground, has practically zero oxygen, but has enough carbon dioxide to burn your lungs, and they live in eternal darkness. But on the bright, not so bright side, temperature-wise, things stay surprisingly stable, usually hovering between 28 and 32 degrees Celsius, or 80 to low 90s in Fahrenheit. And because of that, they've evolved perhaps the most unmammal-like thing ever, which is saying something considering the previous adaptations. They're cold. In other words, cold-blooded. Well, kind of. The scientific term is poikilothermic, meaning its body temperature changes with the environment, like a reptile. And that's a huge deal because almost all mammals are warm-blooded, homeothermic, meaning we regulate our own internal temperature within a narrow range regardless of what's going on outside, which is really one of the core things that make mammals, well, mammals. And it is this which has allowed us to take over so many ecological niches. We can hunt in the snow, burrow in the desert, or hang from trees in the tropics, and still keep our internal engines humming along just fine. But the naked mole rat took one look at that evolutionary strategy and went, no thanks. And calling that extremely rare is kind of an understatement, because of the roughly 6,500 known species of mammals, almost 100% are warm-blooded, which thus begs the question of how does that even work? Well, first, they don't really generate much heat in the first place. Naked mole rats have a very low metabolic rate, especially compared to similarly sized mammals, and that means their body just doesn't produce a lot of excess energy to begin with, so there's not much heat to retain in the first place. And then the small amount of heat they do produce, they don't really retain that well due to a lack of an insulating layer beneath their skin, and the fact that their brown fat, a tissue mammals use for thermogenesis, works at a greatly reduced capacity. So instead of heating themselves internally, they regulate temperature behaviorally. They huddle together in piles, sometimes dozens at a time, to share warmth. And then they also build nest chambers at just the right depth, where the earth is naturally warm and stable. And surprisingly, this strategy works quite well, with the only real downside for them being that they're pretty limited in where they can live, because understandably, they don't tolerate the cold or large temperature fluctuations well. So, no Deadpool rat in Europe anytime soon, at least hopefully. So, by now we've established that the naked mole rat breaks most mammalian rules, but this next one, this is basically where it fully uninstalls the mammalian operating system, so to speak, and instead installs the Anto-S. Because these guys don't just live in colonies, they live in eusocial ones. And yeah, that probably doesn't mean anything to you, so let me explain. Eusociality is the most extreme form of social organization in the animal kingdom. It's the system you see in ants, termites, and some bees and wasps. And it's essentially where you have a single breeding queen, a handful of reproductive males, and a large, non-reproducing worker class that handles pretty much everything else. Digging, defending, caring for young, etc. And in mammals, this is supposed to be impossible. I mean, we're vertebrates after all, with complex brains and even more complicated family drama. So the idea that one of us would evolve to essentially give up personal freedom and the ability to have sex seems kind of mind-boggling. But of course, then along came Heterocephalus glaber. In 1981, South African biologist Jennifer Jarvis cracked open a tunnel system and realized that the naked mole rats were doing something truly bizarre. They were behaving like insects. At the top of the food chain is the queen, the only female in the colony who breeds, and she mates with just 1 to 3 males, with everyone else being sterile. That's 70 to 300 individuals, all genetically capable of reproducing, but are biologically and socially blocked from doing it. And the queen keeps this control with a combination of aggression, with her literally headbutting subordinates into submission, and hormonal signaling that suppress reproductive hormones in the rest of the colony. And what's crazy is that the workers themselves are also physically changed based on their role, which again is like insects. You have the smaller workers who do the digging, foraging, and tunnel maintenance, and then you have essentially the more infrequent workers, but who serve more like guards and defenders, being bulkier, more aggressive, and pretty much ready to throw down at any point. And then weirdly, you also have another class called the dispersers, which are basically super horny naked mole rats, who also don't like working with others, and are only interested in getting out of the colony and finding a new one where they can perform the deed. And then unsurprisingly, even the queen's body is different. Once she ascends the throne, which is usually preceded by violently overthrowing the previous queen, she undergoes a complete physiological transformation. For example, her spine elongates, which makes room for her to carry huge litters, with sometimes one litter being over 25 pups at one time. And this all makes for a degree of eusociality at a level that no other mammal has even come close to reaching. Except that is for one close cousin, the Damaraland mole rat, which did evolve a similar structure. But other than that, this is pretty much it. Out of the 6,500 plus species of mammals, only 2 do this. So yeah, they're freaking weird. So with the combination of being immune to pain, cancer, and aging to an extent, all the while combining the efficiency of a beehive, you'd probably think they're pretty close to invincible. And honestly, they're not doing too bad for themselves, being an animal with the conservation status of least concern. But that doesn't mean there's no threats. As with most animals, once humans become involved, things start to change. And while they're not endangered yet, they do face some serious threats. For one, habitat loss is a real issue. As human populations spread out, urbanization and farming are encroaching on the areas where these guys live. And like I mentioned, their underground tunnel systems are essential to their survival. And so if these get destroyed, game over. And if that's not enough, climate change is making things worse. The soil temperatures, moisture levels, acidity, and stability of their tunnels are all getting messed up, which is again not exactly ideal for a creature that's built to live in a specific, albeit harsh environment. And if the temperature of our world continues to change at this rapid pace, there's a very good chance they just won't be able to keep up. But why does all this matter? Well, aside from the fact that we don't want to lose a creature that's basically Deadpool, naked mole rats have also become a biomedical research goldmine. Their ability to survive cancer, resist aging, and handle chronic pain could unlock many new treatments for humans. But honestly, beyond that, they're just freaking cool. I mean, sure, the real Deadpool can actually regenerate and come back from the dead, but ask yourself this: could he survive a sealed, basically oxygen-free tunnel with no light, perpetual carbon dioxide overdoses, and a shrieking, bald queen demanding absolute control over everything for 30 plus years? Yeah, I didn't think so. Thanks for watching, and until next time.